Throwaway account for obvious reasons. I'm not looking for absolution, karma, or a Netflix deal. I just need to get this out somewhere anonymous, somewhere it won't echo back into my real life. My name isn't really William, but it's close enough. I'm in my late 30s now, with a job that looks clean on paper and a past that absolutely isn't. This is one story from a long list, but it's the one that still wakes me up some nights because it started as something I told myself didn't matter. The crime? Customer data theft. I know. That probably sounds abstract, boring even. Not a gun, not blood, not a dramatic headline. Just data. Numbers in a database. Rows and columns. Emails, addresses, birthdays, purchase histories. I told myself that at the time, and I believed it, mostly. The backstory is painfully mundane. I was working for a mid-sized company that handled user subscriptions for other businesses. We had access to everything. Full profiles. Payment metadata. Support tickets where people overshared their lives because they thought they were talking to a faceless system. I wasn't rich, I wasn't desperate, but I was angry in that quiet, simmering way that doesn't feel dangerous until it is. Passed over for promotions. Watching executives talk about user trust, while cutting corners everywhere else. My motive wasn't some grand villain speech. It was resentment mixed with curiosity and a little greed. I wanted to prove I could. I wanted to feel smarter than the system that kept telling me my place. And if I made some money along the way? I told myself the company would barely notice. The thing I didn't expect, what I couldn't have imagined back then, was the moment when the numbers stopped being numbers. When I realized every row was a person who would never know my name, but whose life I could quietly complicate forever. That realization came later. At the start, it felt like a harmless idea I couldn't stop thinking about. At first, I didn't call it stealing. I called it looking, exploring, auditing even. I had legitimate access to the systems, admin-level credentials because I was trusted. That word still makes me laugh in a bitter way. I'd stay late after everyone left, the office lights dimmed automatically at 7, leaving rows of empty desks glowing blue from sleeping monitors. That's when it felt safest. Quiet. Like the building itself was holding its breath with me. I'd open the database dashboards and just scroll. No downloads. No copies. Just looking. I told myself I was curious about how the data was structured. Who wouldn't be? It was massive and messy and powerful. Millions of people distilled into neat little fields. Email here. Phone number there. Last login timestamp. Failed password attempts. Notes from customer service reps like, user very upset, mentioned recent divorce. That was the first crack. Reading those notes felt intimate in a way I wasn't prepared for. These weren't celebrities or criminals or abstract users. They were regular people dumping their worst days into a support ticket because something didn't work and they didn't know who else to talk to. I remember hovering my mouse over one profile for a long time, feeling something like guilt, then pushing it down. I hadn't done anything yet. But I started testing the boundaries. Running queries I didn't need to run. Seeing how much I could pull without triggering alerts. Learning which logs were checked and which ones were basically decorative. It turns out a lot of security is just trust layered on top of apathy. I rationalized everything. The company collected more data than it needed anyway. Half of it was probably being sold already through partners. If anything, I was just exposing a truth. That's what I told myself while memorizing the paths, the permissions, the blind spots. The idea stopped being, what if, and started becoming, when. I never sat down and said, okay, here's the plan to commit a crime. That would have made it real. Instead, I framed it as contingency thinking. Hypotheticals. Mental exercises I pretended were harmless. What I actually did was map everything. I learned which systems talked to which backups were encrypted properly and which ones were just there. I figured out how often access logs were reviewed, spoiler, not often, and more importantly, who reviewed them. There's a difference between security and the appearance of security, and I lived in that gap for weeks. I also started cleaning up my digital footprint. Not deleting things, that draws attention, but blending in. I adjusted my work hours so late nights looked normal. I volunteered for back-end maintenance tasks so my access patterns made sense. I made sure my name showed up everywhere, constantly, so no single action would stand out. At home, I set up a separate laptop. Cash purchase. No personal accounts. I read forums I shouldn't have been on, learned terminology I didn't need for my job. The people there talked about data the way fishermen talk about the sea, endless, impersonal, something you harvest. I told myself I wasn't like them. The biggest preparation wasn't technical, though. It was emotional. I practiced not thinking about the people behind the data. I forced myself to see rows instead of lives. I'd literally say it out loud sometimes. It's just numbers. Repetition helps lies settle in. By the time I was ready, it felt inevitable. Like the crime had already happened in theory, and I was just catching up to it in reality. The night I actually did it didn't feel dramatic. No alarms, no pounding heart at first. Just the soft hum of servers and my own breathing, too loud in my ears. I waited until almost midnight, long after the cleaning crew left, then locked my office door even though no one ever came by. I started small on purpose. A limited dataset. A test. 5,000 records instead of millions. I remember my hands hovering over the keyboard longer than necessary, like my body was stalling even if my mind wasn't. When I finally ran the export command, it took less than 30 seconds. That was the scariest part. No resistance. No warning. Just a progress bar sliding calmly to completion. I saved the file to an encrypted container, named it something boring, something that blended in with my actual work. Then I sat there staring at it, waiting for the guilt to hit like I'd been promised it would. Instead, I felt light. Accomplished. Almost proud. I shut everything down, wiped temporary files, and walked out into the night convinced I'd crossed the line, but not yet sure why it mattered. At home, I told myself I wouldn't open the file right away. That I'd sleep, think it over, maybe even delete it in the morning like this had all been some elaborate stress dream. That lasted about 20 minutes. I cracked open the laptop at my kitchen table, still wearing my jacket. The file loaded slowly, line by line, and for a while it was exactly what I'd expected: emails, IDs, timestamps. Clean. Clinical. Safe. I scrolled like I was reading code, not people. Then I started recognizing patterns. Repeat purchases tied to medical products. Late-night logins from the same IP blocks. Support notes again, those stupid notes. User reports account shared with spouse. Customer mentioned job loss, requested refund. I clicked one profile at random and followed it further than I should have. Social media links. Location data. A full name that led to a real person with photos, kids, a dog, a life that existed completely outside my screen. That's when the phrase "it's just numbers" finally cracked. I closed the laptop hard enough to make the table shake. My heart was racing, not from fear of being caught, but from the sudden, awful clarity that I was holding pieces of strangers' lives in my hands, and I'd taken them without permission. That should have been the moment I stopped. Closed everything, wiped the drive, pretended none of it happened. I even stood there for a while, hands on the table, breathing like I'd just run upstairs, telling myself I still had time to undo it. Instead, I went back to the office the next day and did it again. Guilt has a funny way of turning into momentum. Once you've crossed the line, going back feels harder than pushing forward. I told myself the damage was already done, so one more export wouldn't really change anything. Then another. Then larger batches. Each one faster, cleaner, more confident than the last. I refined my process. Scheduled jobs instead of manual pulls. Randomized times. Split files across drives so no single dataset looked complete. It felt disturbingly professional, like I was just doing a side project no one else knew about. The emotional whiplash was constant. At work, I joked with coworkers and complained about coffee. Inside, my chest buzzed nonstop, half adrenaline, half dread. Every email notification made my stomach drop. Every meeting about user trust felt like a private accusation. But I kept going, because stopping would mean admitting to myself that I was the kind of person who did this. Up until then, it had all been theoretical. I had data, sure, but it was just sitting there like a loaded gun I kept telling myself I'd never fire. The real shift happened when I made contact with someone who wanted it. We didn't meet in person. That felt too real, too risky. It started through an encrypted message board I'd been lurking on for weeks, one of those places where everyone pretends they're just researchers. I posted something vague. Not an offer, more like a question. Someone answered within an hour. They spoke casually, almost bored. Asked about freshness, regions, volume. No moral hesitation, no drama. Just business. That scared me more than anything else so far. I was nervous typing back, rereading every sentence, trying not to sound eager or stupid. We negotiated like two people selling used furniture. Price per record. Delivery method. Proof sample. I sent a tiny slice, barely anything, and when they confirmed it checked out, my phone buzzed with a payment notification. Seeing money attached to the theft flipped a switch in my head. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was commerce. I told myself I'd do it once, get it out of my system, and walk away. I believed that lie for almost a full day. The actual transfer happened on a Sunday, which felt appropriate somehow. Fewer eyes on the network, fewer people awake to notice anything strange. I'd spent the morning pacing my apartment, checking the same steps over and over like a ritual meant to ward off disaster. I packaged the data exactly how we'd agreed, encrypted, segmented, labeled in a way only the buyer would understand. Uploading it took longer than expected, my internet stuttering just enough to make every second feel like a warning. I sat there watching the progress bar, jaw clenched, convinced this would be the moment something went wrong. Nothing did. When the buyer confirmed receipt, I felt a rush so intense it made me dizzy. Relief first, then exhilaration. I checked my account again, real money, sitting there, earned in the quietest, dirtiest way imaginable. I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, then immediately hated myself for it. Afterward, the silence was unbearable. No alarms, no messages, no consequences. Just me and the knowledge that somewhere, data I'd taken was about to be used in ways I didn't want to think about. I tried not to imagine the faces this time. I failed. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't an email or a security alert. It was a meeting invite titled Process Review. Harmless words. Corporate beige. Still, my pulse spiked the moment I saw it. They'd noticed irregular access patterns, they said. Nothing accusatory. Just anomalies. I nodded along, asked the right questions, even suggested a few explanations that weren't me. Legacy permissions. Overlapping roles. Technical debt. The room relaxed when I spoke. That was the worst part, realizing how easily confidence could rewrite suspicion. After that, I got careful in a new way. Paranoid, maybe? I cut my exports in half, spaced them out, scrubbed metadata more aggressively. I justified it as risk management, but really I was afraid. Afraid of logs I didn't know about. Afraid of coworkers remembering something small and out of place. At night, I started dreaming in spreadsheets. Rows turning into faces, faces blurring back into numbers. I'd wake up sweaty, heart racing, then check my phone like a reflex. No messages, no disaster. Still, I kept going. Because stopping now felt like standing still in the middle of traffic. The irony is that I didn't learn about the damage from the buyer. I learned it from work. Customer support started flagging spikes in phishing reports. account takeovers, fraud complaints that followed a very specific pattern. People were angry, scared, confused, asking how someone knew so much about them. Their purchase history, their personal details, things that were never supposed to leave our systems. I sat in on one of those calls once, muted, camera off. A woman was crying, saying her bank account had been drained and her email was flooded with threats. She kept asking what we were going to do to fix it, and all I could think was, I did this. Not directly, maybe, but close enough that the distinction felt cowardly. That night, I pulled up the dataset again and searched for her region. Found dozens of profiles that could have been hers. I stared at them until my vision blurred. The money didn't feel good anymore. It felt heavy. Tainted. I stopped checking my balance and started calculating how many lives I'd nudged off course without ever touching them. That was when fear finally gave way to guilt. The knock never came, but it felt like it was always one step behind me. Security escalated things quietly. External auditors. New access controls rolled out overnight. Password rotations. Multi-factor prompts that hadn't existed before. Every change felt like a net tightening, even when no one was looking at me directly. Then a coworker, someone I trusted, made an offhand comment. "Hey, you used to pull a lot of bulk queries, right? Do you remember why?" He said it casually, half smiling, like he was asking about an old project. My mouth went dry. I gave him an answer I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times, and he nodded, satisfied. I went to the bathroom afterward and locked myself in a stall, breathing through a wave of nausea. My reflection looked normal, which somehow made it worse. No visible signs of guilt, no mark of what I'd done. That night I wiped everything. Drives destroyed. Accounts closed. I burned bridges and forums and vanished without explanation. It felt less like escape and more like surrender, accepting that I couldn't undo the harm, only stop adding to it. I waited for consequences. They never came. Getting away with it wasn't the relief I'd imagined. It was a sentence without an end date. Life went on. Promotions. Holidays. Casual conversations about weekend plans. I nodded, smiled, played my part. Inside, everything felt slightly off, like I was watching my own life through a pane of glass. I kept expecting the past to catch up to me in some tangible way, a letter, a lawsuit, a name in the news. Instead, it lingered in quieter forms. Every data breach headline made my stomach drop. Every mention of privacy in a meeting felt personal. I avoided conversations about ethics because I didn't trust myself not to flinch. I donated money to causes I didn't care about, hoping guilt could be amortized like debt. The strangest part was realizing how easy it would be to do it again. The systems were still flawed. The temptation never fully left. That scared me more than getting caught ever had. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I couldn't fully disown it either. It was part of me now, stitched into who I'd become. Freedom, it turns out, can feel a lot like surveillance. For a long time, I survived on justifications. I'd line them up in my head like legal arguments. The company was careless. The buyers would have found data somewhere else. I never targeted anyone personally. On bad days, I'd even tell myself I was a symptom, not the disease. The problem is that rationalizations don't age well. They rot. The more distance I got from the crime, the weaker those excuses sounded. Time stripped away the adrenaline and left the core choice exposed. No one forced my hands onto that keyboard. No one tricked me into pressing export. I wanted to, and that was enough. I started noticing how often I avoided thinking about intent. Consequences were easier, external, measurable. Intent was personal. It meant admitting that a part of me valued feeling clever and powerful more than protecting strangers I'd never meet. That realization hurt more than fear ever did. Fear fades. This didn't. I began to understand that the worst consequence wasn't legal or financial. It was learning something permanent and unflattering about myself, and knowing I couldn't unlearn it. I used to think crimes were events, things you do, then move past. I was wrong. They're lenses. Once you've looked through one, the world never quite snaps back into place. I became quieter, more cautious, but not in a noble way. I started scanning people for what they might hide, what leverage systems gave them without realizing it. Trust stopped feeling innocent. Even kindness felt conditional, like I was always waiting to see the catch. I didn't confess to anyone. Not friends, not partners. I tried once, vaguely, framing it as a moral dilemma from work, and the look on their face shut me up fast. Some truths don't want to be shared, they just want to sit with you. I also noticed something uglier, part of me missed it. The clarity. The focus. The feeling of being dangerously competent. I hated that part of myself, but pretending it didn't exist felt like lying all over again. So I live with awareness instead. Watching myself. Questioning impulses. Knowing exactly how thin the line is, because I've stepped over it before. And I know I could again, if I'm not careful. If there's a reason I'm writing this, it's not confession as redemption. It's a warning, plain and simple. Crimes like mine don't start with malice. They start with distance. With telling yourself that what you're touching isn't real, that the people affected are theoretical, that responsibility is diffused enough to disappear. That lie is seductive, and it's everywhere, especially in systems built to scale humans into data. If you're anywhere near that edge, feeling clever, wrong, curious, or bored, hear this: the moment you stop seeing faces, you're already in trouble. The damage won't always look dramatic, but it will be real, and some of it will land on people who did nothing to deserve it. I got away with what I did, legally speaking. But I didn't escape it. It changed how I see myself, and that's a quiet punishment that doesn't fade. If you still have the chance to step back, take it. Pride heals slower than guilt, and power borrowed from harm always charges interest.